the Good Friday agreements. And yet, when we saw those clashes last month, I mean, the images from places like Shankill Road on one side, the Falls Road on the other, those neighborhoods, they haven't changed much, it seems, since before the Good Friday agreements. You still have this abject poverty in a lot of these places. Why is it still like that?
Well, the reason it's like that is because of the failure of the Northern Ireland executive to do anything about the abject poverty. But it's also because the fact that the north of Ireland has always, really, since the Second World War, has been the poorest region in the UK. The UK doesn't have a regional economic policy where they can pour money into a particular part of the country. These areas have been neglected. The education system doesn't serve them well. The employment situation has changed dramatically, where it used to be heavy industry, it used to be textiles. All that is gone now, and it has never been successfully replaced with anything which can deal with these people who are coming out of school with no qualifications in the areas that you mentioned in particular, in West Belfast, but also in Derry and parts of North Belfast. There are large numbers of children leave school with no qualifications whatsoever. And the Northern Ireland Executive never devised a policy to deal with the abject poverty and the continuing poverty in those areas. But at the same time, you need to get those disturbances into perspective. Those were not serious disturbances. There was no gunfire. There was no heavy involvement of paramilitaries. Many of the people out rioting were children, 12, 13, 14 years old. And it also happened over a weekend. None of them was at school. But now that they're all back again at school. And it just hasn't been a heavily organised mass protest. And it was played up in the media because the pictures of fireworks and so on were spectacular. But it was nothing like the sort of trouble that happened 20, 25 years ago.
But Brian, you mentioned a failure. You mentioned a failure of the executive. And I have to ask you this question because on this show, we've dealt in the past with the protests that have been going on in places like Lebanon, Iraq, where you have power sharing built into the rules. Is the problem the fact that you're always going to have, no matter what, with the Northern Ireland, with the Good Friday agreements, you always have power sharing and therefore a problem with accountability?
Well, it's not as simple as that. I mean, that tends to simplify the problem. One of the real difficulties here is that there is no real economic independence. The executive is actually, it's not a government, it's administration. It administers the money that comes from the UK. And they can't raise their own money. They don't have any real powers in taxation or anything else. But they simply look after each side. And it depends. Really, they operate in silos rather than together. They don't sit down. They can't agree on economic policy. They've repeatedly said that they want to establish an economic policy, and they talk about what they were going to do years ahead. But the last 5 years have been pretty disastrous because just at the time Brexit happened, the executive collapsed for 3 years. And, well, what do you expect after 3 years of no strategic economic government? The sort of poverty that we have in parts of Belfast and Derry is bound to be really a lot worse than it was.
You agree, Graham Gudgeon, that poverty, you can blame it on a failure of leadership in Belfast, but also on London?
No, I don't. I don't even believe there is the poverty that Brian was referring to there. It's certainly not abject. Living standards in Northern Ireland are fairly close to the UK average. Unemployment, Northern Ireland has now got one of the lowest unemployment rates of the whole UK. Wages are rather lower, but then prices are low. It's much easier to buy a house in Northern Ireland, for instance, than it is where I live in Cambridge. Young people couldn't buy a house, but in Northern Ireland they...
16% of the population lives below the poverty line. Those are high numbers.
Yeah, but that's a relative concept. The poverty line is defined as 60% of the average. You know, you're always going to a percentage of the population has always got to be below that. It's not absolute poverty. It's just a relative statistical measure. The problem in Northern Ireland isn't poverty. It is a problem of national identity. There are 1 million people in Northern Ireland who see themselves as British, and they want to remain British forever. And anything that threatens that, and the border in the Irish Sea is seen as a threat, anything that threatens that causes a great deal of trouble and upset. Brian's right. I think the degree of violence we saw a few weeks ago by Northern Ireland standards wasn't all that serious, but it may well get much more serious over the summer once the COVID lockdown finishes and once we get into what's called the marching season. So there may be a good deal more to come, but very little to do with poverty in my view.